And now let me welcome Professor Swan Singh, Foreign Affairs expert from JNU in our Delhi studio. I also welcome Ambassador Gurjeet Singh, former senior diplomat, joining us on the show. Namaste, sir. And we will be joined by Greg Simon in a short while from Sweden also. Professor Singh, if I may bring you in here. Now, having said that, India's role in the current summit, considering this is taking place in the backdrop of Russia-Ukraine conflict, sir, and India has already offered multiple times a role of mediator. Yesterday also Prime Minister spoke about need of aid and assisting. In that situation where Russia is also looking at getting isolated, perhaps that's the parallel narrative, there is a signal to the West as well. You're looking at expansion at one side, you're looking at Russia trying to reach out to the rest of the world, and we're also looking at India being seen as a very important bridge between global north and global south. There's a lot that's going to transpire in this BRICS summit. Do you agree?
Surely, Sakal, it is taking place in the backdrop of this ongoing Ukraine crisis, which is where we saw that earlier the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi had proposed a 13-point peace proposal, which was clearly demolished by the Western world, saying that it's absolutely not acceptable. Then the West organized their own Swiss Peace Summit, where China and Russia did not join. India joined but did not sign the final communique. Compared to these two, I think India's approach of a very subtle, piecemeal, modest approach of communicating between two sides, with Prime Minister himself going to Moscow in July and then followed by his visit to Kiev. Now again he is in Moscow. I think that is a very subtle way of at least accelerating the possibilities of peace process, peace talks at some stage, and that seems to become increasingly credible for both sides, for Ukraine as well as for Russia, which no other initiative has achieved so far. What is also most interesting is that BRICS collectively, which is a grouping of economic powers, rising economies, has China, which is the second largest economy on the planet, but has India, which is right now 5th largest, but soon to be 3rd largest, but fastest growing economy among these BRICS nations. And what makes India special here? Most of the BRICS members are seen, at least barring the new 5, particularly the original 5, are seen as countries that are not comfortable with the Western world. And in that, India is the only country which is as much comfortable with United States and European nations as it is with China, Russia and rest of the BRICS nations. So India's, I think, effort here also is to make sure that BRICS remains an organization which is not Western, it's different from Western organizations, but it is not anti-Western organization. And therefore focus should remain, as the theme says, on multilateralism, development and security. And they can do a lot in that sense. Why? Because right now energy, which is the driver of global development, about 45% of oil export is from countries of the BRICS, and largest importer, number 1 and number 2 of the world, China and India, are also in the BRICS. And they are talking increasingly of using local currencies, de-dollarization, which is what is making BRICS extremely attractive. So in Johannesburg, President Ramaphosa had said 43 countries had approached to join BRICS, and right now in Russia 34 countries have joined, approached to join BRICS. That, I think, is something that really worries Western nations, that BRICS is becoming increasingly very attractive grouping, and India has a very unique position.
But just your thoughts on where Ambassador Gurjeet left.
I think what is most significant is simply to see the body language of President Putin, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, and the comfort and the warmth that you saw while Prime Minister Modi was meeting President Vladimir Putin. Whereas in terms of conversations, India is fairly clear that it should not be seen taking sides of either Ukraine or Russia while it is trying to make peace between these two nations. And that is a very significant agenda, I think, even now in this meeting for Prime Minister, to make sure that peace process moves forward and
you think
war
that's
comes
going
to
to be discussed, specifically India's role of mediation?
I think India is going to discuss this issue not only now with President Putin, but I think that issue might come up even with President Xi Jinping's
No,
conversations
in
with
terms
Indian
of
Prime Minister.
crystallizing, I mean, India has had this position since last years and they've not budged, and we stand for peace and we are not taking sides.
Absolutely.
We are taking India's sides, but we are neutral. But do you think there is something concrete that could be expected vis-a-vis India's role here?
What happens, Sakal, in such situations, we might come to know what was happening several months later.
Yeah.
Because the very style of India's intervention is not do any grandstanding, not any brownie points.
Right, right.
The focus is to make sure in a very subtle fashion, without much glare of public media to create expectations, inch by inch move forward. And I think so far repeated visits of not just Prime Minister but
Yes.
also Foreign Minister, National Security Advisor is an incremental
I think
change.
yes, incremental change. Multipolarity of India is India advantage. At the same time, India's alignment with these aspiring nations and those who are already in the ambit of the expanded BRICS, especially Egypt, Arab and Iran. We've had a bilateral with them yesterday. So India's role in terms of aiding and navigating through difficult conversations that will come up, because each nation have, they have their own aspirations slash, things to look forward to.
That's right. Every nation will be guided by their own interests. But every nation also comes alive in terms of what is their essential character. India, right from the very beginning, even when we had difficulties at home, we were very global in our approach, we were very international, we were always part of all multilateral efforts. So in that sense, multilateralism is deeply ingrained in India's psyche, India's behavior. And President Putin is projecting BRICS summit meeting in Russia now as Russia's largest ever multilateral event with 40 countries represented there. And remember, Russia, China, India are also seen as representatives of Global South now. So Global South also gets connected to Russia, China, India, though of course they all are pushing for Global South. Their strategies are slightly at variance from one another. So that is where I think meetings like this could also be an opportunity to find a kind of a common ground.
The largest gathering of the world leaders in Russia in decades, and that too at a time when, Kremlin is locked in a war on Western-backed Ukraine. And here we are also looking at India's role as a bridge between the North, South and the Western BRICS. So your thoughts on it? Okay. Yes, Professor Singh.
I think I fully agree that the very economic heft of BRICS, even if it keeps focusing on not becoming anti-Western, does create anxieties in Western countries. For example, the whole report that you showed in the beginning about how much collectively BRICS stands for in terms of population, in terms of economy, it's already much, much bigger in population definitely, but even in economy much bigger than G7 nations that even today continue to control Bretton Woods institutions, whether it is World Bank or International Monetary Fund. And the voting weightage which need to change over a period of time, they are very reluctant to allow newly emerging economies to get that kind of decision making weightage in these international bodies. IMF is already always controlled by Europe. World Bank president is always an American citizen. What about China, which is about nearly 20 trillion economy now? From 2017, China is the world's largest donor country. So BRICS is projecting itself without appearing to be anti-Western as a collective which is becoming a glue of Global South, and therefore an anxiety for Western nations, who sometimes also go as far as to do name calling of all kinds. But fundamentally the worry is that the global economic trends are going to be gradually going away from their control, and it seems that the global economic decision making, global financial trends, de-dollarization, use of local currencies is all gradually kind of creating a paranoia in the West that looks at BRICS from that angle. And now particularly you see President Erdogan is in Kazan also. He's a NATO member who's trying to join BRICS. ASEAN, which was created to block spread of communism and soft balance China, Malaysia, Thailand are trying to join BRICS. This obviously creates anxiety in the Western nations, but there is no denying that the attraction of BRICS is expanding like a wildfire.
But is there also this this underlining idea of Russia sending a message to the West, the messaging of it?
Indeed, Russia being denied any opportunity to engage with the global forums is treating this summit meeting as its kind of face-saving opportunity to organize a huge meeting where Russia is present and hosting it.
Professor Singh, with that, there is a sort of maybe writing on the wall, given the current context of the BRICS, that if you look at the members, the aspiring members and those who are already there, BRIC has it in it to shift or to sort of induce, if not shift, induce some sort of shift in the current world order.
I will go circle a step forward.
Where India will have a meaty role.
I will go a step forward and say it is already doing that. It's not that it will do the transformation in global financial decision making. It is already forcing Bretton Woods institutions to relook at the voting weightage, except that their strategy to do that is very different. They are doing it what they call equally proportional, that everybody gets a certain point added, rather than making it proportional to what the contributions the countries are bringing to the table. So in that sense, it is already compelling Bretton Woods institutions to seek out certain reforms. Of course, reforms in United Nations is a separate matter. We are only focusing on economic decision making. And the whole lot of initiatives, your program began by saying that BRICS countries could, in this summit meeting, could also initiate some discussion on parallels to things like Western Union, money transfers. They could create they were talking about credit agency of their own earlier, partly because of the Ukraine crisis. Some of these initiatives have gone into a little deep freezer. They could come back again. Their new development bank is very successful. And the way they take decisions is very different. It's not based on how much of the stake each country has in the capital in the bank. It's more equitable decision making that takes place. They have opened a regional office in South Africa. About 15 plus countries have received all kinds of assistance from New Development Bank, and they have also the currency reserve pool, for example, in dealing with the sudden fluctuations in currencies around the world. So some of their decisions, especially the increase in their use of local currencies in their bilateral trade, that is a substantive step forward. So in that sense, incrementally, by doing so many things, either within BRICS or BRICS collectively for rest of the world, they are already transforming global economic and financial transactions, trends and decision making. And that is what is forcing Bretton Woods institutions dominated by Western powers to also gradually, reluctantly, they are reticent, but they are trying to reform gradually themselves, not at the speed that BRICS nations want them to change. And if that doesn't happen, BRICS is creating parallel mechanisms of their own.
So the question is who pushes, question is who pushes the button, and it's time to now walk the talk. And we've been talking about this whole reforms at the WTO, Professor Singh, and reforms at the UNSC, where a certain country doesn't want to, that doesn't mean that we'll keep waiting and just talking about it. And today, the fact that, can we go to Jessica again, the fact that we are looking at this bilateral between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi, I think
this lot is being made out of the bilateral that is going to happen between Indian Prime Minister and Chinese President. One has to put it into sort of perspective by looking at the complexities that exist. So yes, in the final 2 points on the line of actual control, Depsang and Demchok, what has been agreed upon is arrangements for patrolling and grazing rights, as was said. Lot is still left. Disengagement to actually be implemented, de-escalation to be achieved, then finally going back to the position of February 2020, then beginning to talk of peace and tranquility. So it's a lot of work still to be done, and together they're not just talking of bilateral problems on the border, they have other bilateral issues. Then they have responsibilities for the region, they have global responsibilities, but this you can call it a breakthrough that has made it possible for have a to have a formal bilateral meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Narendra Modi is a good inflection point to start afresh. And I go back to April this year was the first time Indian Prime Minister's interview in Newsweek had said we should, leave the past for the past and look for future and begin to, see how can we work together. And incrementally, so many things have happened since then. And that is the kind of conclusion of that entire effort, that two leaders are beginning to meet. And my hope is the best they can do is, even if they don't publicize it, they can build an understanding if they can revive their informal summit meetings. That was the most innovative, thing that India and China had achieved in entire history of international relations. No big two leaders had ever spoken of informal summits, no agenda, just beginning to share notes and develop a common understanding. It had produced good results. So even if it is not publicized, if they can develop an understanding of reviving informal summits, I think this meeting would be really fruitful for that.
It's not about criticism. Actually, in Ukraine, do you think Professor Singh he has a point when they say that, well, you didn't come to Ukraine Peace Summit, but you agreed to, just to understand the dynamics. India is neutral. India has always been neutral. Well, that is clear.
See, the clear aim of UN Secretary General addressing and meeting BRICS nations in the summit meeting is a clear focus on Ukraine crisis should come to an end.
Very clear.
That's his clear focus. And since in the Swiss summit, where he was also there, some of these nations were not even invited, others did not attend. A very important set of countries that have direct, intervention in that conflict. Russia directly is a party to the conflict, had no opportunity to have a conversation with UN Secretary General. So therefore, important for him not only have conversations with Western nations, but also have conversations with Russia, China and other stakeholders in the BRICS nations to find out how he can help develop that understanding where peace talks can become a possibility. India is at the center of that exercise today. So in that sense, India is doing, much more in terms of bringing, possibilities of some kind of peace talks. And I think there is a correlation here that Secretary General and Indian Prime Minister share that the aim of also working for bringing peace in Ukraine. So Indian Prime Minister is there for BRICS nations, for peace in Ukraine, for bilateral relations with Xi Jinping, resolving China-India relations. So it's a packed schedule in that sense, and that brings in India again and again into focus as to what is India bringing to the table, what is India trying to do in that sense. And I think that BRICS, because it is becoming extremely attractive, so many new nations wants to get into it, makes it an important platform for UN to engage them as well.
Yes. Now let's just take this discussion a little forward and talk about the theme this year and these pillars that have been identified by the chair, which is the practice.
Yes.
It is well timed. But then do you think this is also a little precarious for the Russia chairmanship or presidentship to navigate through some difficult conversations, because whether he likes it or not, but the war is still on, whether they call it an onslaught or an offensive or whatever, there has been a lot of bloodshed in the last 3 years on both sides, because we are talking about humanitarian crises, because we have security on the anvil here, on the BRICS anvil.
Absolutely, because BRICS works on consensus, and if building consensus among 5 took so long, they had to speak, their Sherpas were talking for 2.5 years before the new members could be agreed upon. And Indonesia withdrew the nomination before they were invited to become member. Argentina's government changed, they said we don't want to become members. Saudi Arabia is still studying various guidelines and criterion, has not yet become a full member. Now building consensus among 9 nations would be an important challenge for the host nation as to on how many issues they can ensure that consensus is built. Focus very clearly is to expand not in terms of membership, but in terms of new nomenclatures of dialogue partners, special visitors, special invitees, observers. You remember India was an observer for quite some time on BRICS and then became a full member. So now the nomenclature is partners. I understand in the bilateral discussions between President Putin and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, they tried to discuss also as to what should be the criterion and guidelines to bring in new partner nations. That could also have been an issue in several other bilaterals that President Putin has had, and I'm saying could be an issue when Indian Prime Minister meets the Chinese President as well. So focus is, can we bring in some new nations who are aspirant? Because right now, after the last foreign ministers meeting, the membership, they have put a pause on the meeting as of now. So members are not going to be added. Partners likely to be added, because then those aspirant nations will continue to feel excited about, if not joining as members, at least aligning with BRICS, which is a thriving organization. So stay connected with that. And in that sense, I think challenges would be also in how to sustain that whole focus on multilateralism, ensure development. Sustainable development is a major challenge. SSD goals are being derailed, and a whole lot of challenges in those sustainable development goals also. And then finally, security brings an issue of Ukraine, as you said. What is the mindset that each of these leaders...
Security is one of the pillars.
Absolutely. So
and humanitarian crisis.
Yes. So what each of the leaders are going to say today, I am assuming Indian Prime Minister is definitely going to underline issue of terrorism. He will indicate what are his thoughts on partners as to what should be the ways and whether should be bring in new partners. He's definitely going to underline sustainable development goals being derailed, and we need to work together. He's going to focus on global governance, particularly financial governance, I assume. And also finally, I think he's going to definitely bring in what can India bring to the table, because there are now increasing expectations from India as to what can India do on a multilateral forums like BRICS. So I assume there could be some indications, and in his speeches we very often hear very interesting abbreviations. So maybe we will see one more interesting abbreviation coming up in his speech in few hours.
Since we have a former diplomat on the show, let us... Sir.
Indeed, as I was listening...
I think it is very inclusive.
It's
very contemporary.
It's very inclusive. I was carefully listening to when you were telling the main points. I noticed that on development, Prime Minister's main focus has remained on well-being rather than looking at minimal agenda. He's looking at well-being focus of development.
Macro view.
And on security, he's focusing large areas of non-traditional security, including traditional terrorism was likely to be an issue there, but also on cyber security, health security, and so on. So here the projection of where India wants to take BRICS is not just to focus on minimal requirements of humanity, but now focus on what much more can be brought to humanity in terms of their well-being, their progress, their development, their security, not just physical security, but cyber security, health security, and so on. So I think it's a much more ambitious agenda. And very interesting, the repeatedly underlined the focus on the convention that India has been pursuing at United Nations from 1994 to bring in a countering terrorism convention at the United Nations, which should define what is terrorism and as to then how to tackle terrorism collectively at the global level, because terrorism is not only one country's problem, it's every country's problem. We have seen even the most developed countries are also vulnerable to terrorism in that sense, and that has to be clearly the focus of BRICS nations collectively and take the matters to United Nations in that sense. So I think it's a fairly comprehensive, exhaustive items that are brought to focus by Indian Prime Minister, and in each of these then India also intends to make its own contribution, whether it is in terms of being the pharmacy of the world or being a country that is willing to freely share DPIs, digital public infrastructure, online payments, and all sorts of platforms that India has built in dealing with pandemic and so on, and dealing with deepfakes. I mean, that's another major issue Prime Minister has underlined for several years now. The deepfakes is another challenge, and particularly the public personalities, facing this challenge could lead to a whole lot of what WHO calls infodemics. Not just pandemics, but infodemics could result from deepfakes, and that's a major issue again Prime Minister has underlined for several years now, which again is underlined here. So I think it's a fairly exhaustive list of items that need to be attended and areas where India can contribute.
Professor Singh, there is also, would you like to come in there?
Yeah, sure.
We have more inputs coming in, but just...
Yeah, definitely. I think what we should also remember is there's a trio of Turkey, Malaysia, Pakistan, who are also trying to join BRICS, all three of them. And it may not be intended, but it has implications when we underline the issue of cross-border terrorism, terror financing, and so on. then should we have sort of
there are considerable amount of space given to this countering terror,
yes,
financing
indeed,
terrorism,
indeed.
and conventions at the UN.
Maybe there could be a thought behind it that Pakistan is pushing its own case to join BRICS. China would fully support it. Russia would be lukewarm.
But the name hasn't figured out yet.
Name has not figured out yet, but obviously this could have some implications to looking at whether we should think of Pakistan as a possible partner nation, if not member, or should we think of Malaysia. Turkey, of course, is being majorly debated. They are almost willing to counterbalance NATO in terms of by joining BRICS. So terrorism, as I said, is a global problem. India has been saying that from mid-1990s. It's not only India's problem, and therefore there has to be collective effort at the United Nations. And Prime Minister has underlined it in almost all places wherever he has visited, in all the joint statements, in all his speeches. His concern for terrorism is always there, and I was expecting, but as you said, it's fairly in an exhaustive detail here.
And now coming to the other interesting aspect, Professor Singh, and I take this to others as well, but you first. India is ready to welcome new countries into BRICS, that on the expansion one, as partner countries. So India again having a very positive and inclusive approach as far as letting the other member nations being part of the BRICS ambit. Prime Minister said that in this regard, all decisions should be taken by consensus and the views of the BRICS founding members should be respected. BRICS founding members, for which India happens to be the founding members. The guiding principles, standards, criteria and procedures adopted during the Johannesburg summit should be complied with by one and all and partner countries.
Absolutely. So here it is an expression of intent. In principle, India is welcoming that new nations could, if not join, align. I mean, they may not become members, they could become partners, observers and so on. Right now we are using the word partners. So because there is such an upswing in the excitement of so many nations trying to join, there has to be some hope given to them. You cannot say that we have put a permanent...
And some mechanism also.
Absolutely. There has to be certain criterion, mechanism. Last time I said they took 2.5 years of negotiating as to what will be criterion to bring in new members. And that will be again followed. So in principle, Prime Minister has agreed, he is more than willing to welcome new partners. But the whole consensus focus, the whole focus on guidelines and procedures means it's going to be a something in the making over a coming period of time. But since the host country, President Putin, has put kind of this as a priority, important area to focus on, that we should have new partner nations, and Indian Prime Minister, has a very good close relationship with President Putin. And in that sense, it's supporting the host nation, that for the host nation, if this is an important agenda, then we would like to make sure India is publicly announcing its welcoming new members.
Professor Singh.
I think I agree with Ambassador Singh. Surely the language that has been agreed upon in preceding joint statements would be reflected. But each host nation also tries to showcase the distinction that it brings to bear on joint statement. I think some common language on what kind of new partners and how new partners would be inducted in coming times could be something added as...
But it says consensus as far as the founding members.
So that is what the effort is, and I think India is trying to not just be there as a member but also help facilitate for the host how to build consensus, and therefore that statement that India would welcome new partners and discussions on criterion and guidelines and so on is an indication as a major power in BRICS nations as to what India thinks wants to be added as a new element to the joint statement. Of course, all the other areas of cyber security, climate change, terrorism, inflation, people to people relations, these things all will be there. But I think among new things could be the language on security. We want to see what is the new language on security,
the language
on humanitarian assistance, on crisis, wars, conflicts. What is the new language that Russia wants to bring in the joint statement would be very interesting. What China wants to bring in terms of global financial governance could be interesting. India's focus largely is inclusive, global, futuristic. That is how India's speech, as it appears to me, the way you explained us, appears to be. And where does India sees itself contributing So in technology sectors like critical and emerging technologies, India is well placed to contribute. In health sector, India is well placed to contribute. India has been a constant, flag bearer of countering terrorism issues, and of course the whole issue of how to achieve the expansion without opening up membership at this stage, because the last membership process is still on. Saudi Arabia is yet to join, and we don't know what happens to Argentina in that sense. So not to put a halt to new nations who want to join and align with BRICS nations. So I think there are multiple ways India has tried to project as to how India can contribute in building that consensus for the joint statement.
We were discussing that BRICS coming up as an alternative to the global bodies or counterbalancing the world order. Now, if you look at this line where Prime Minister says that our approach, which means India's approach, must remain people-centric, adding that the BRICS, the message that should go out is that BRICS is not divisive organization.
Absolutely.
Not divisive, but that works in the interest of humanity. So the element of inclusivity.
Absolutely. And that is the whole focus. Repeatedly, Dr. Jaishankar, the foreign minister, has explained it is non-Western, it is not anti-Western. This is something popularized by Dr. Jaishankar, that India sees BRICS, not all members see it that way. Maybe China and Russia looks at BRICS in a slightly different fashion as an alternative to West. But India doesn't see it that way. India is focused on how it can do the bridge building between East and West, North and South, bring in global South to the center stage the way India did in the global G20 summit meeting last year. So reformation, again, when Prime Minister says need to reform global institutions, is not limited to myopic India-centric approach. Indian Prime Minister is looking at how we can accommodate global institutions becoming more representative, which is where global South comes in. Should Africa should have a seat also on the big table of UN Security Council. So I think India is no longer myopic.
But we gave that seat to Africa during G20, and
Absolutely.
that sets the,
in fact, Saril, I often now say the onus is no longer on India. Onus now is on UN Security Council to become representative of the world we live in. India outside is a question on credibility of UN Security Council rather than a question on India today. So India is not looking at reformation of global institutions in terms of what India is going to get. India is looking at global good and people-centric approach, where we should have institutions that really represent the issues and stakeholders of the time we live in, rather than continue to live in 20th century, which is not going to make them effective. And we have seen United Nations losing that efficacy over a period of time, whether it is in West Asia or in Ukraine.
So we